The concept of Kedusha, holiness. What is holy and what's ordinary? What determines if something has a holy status or is in a holy state or ordinary? Holy is referred to as Kodosh or Kedusha. Ordinary is called Chulin, Chol, ordinary. The weekday is called Yemei HaChol, weekday. The seventh day of the week is called Shabbos Kodesh, the Holy Sabbath. What is the basis for holiness? The few references in the Torah. The first time the word Kodesh is mentioned, Moshe Rabbeinu is in Midian, and he's shepherding the flocks of his father, Yisro, in the desert, and all of a sudden he sees something unusual. He sees a burning bush. The bush is burning, but the bush is not being consumed by the fire. He approaches that location. All of a sudden he hears a voice. It was an angel of God saying to him, remove your shoes, because Admas Kodesh, because the earth you're standing on is hallowed ground. It's holy earth. Therefore, remove your shoes. First time the word Kedusha is mentioned. Admas Kodesh, it's holy, hallowed ground. The next time we find the word Kedusha mentioned, holiness, is when we, at Sinai, when we were taken as Jewish people, we referred to as Goy Kadosh. When we accepted Torah Sinai, we became a holy people, holy nation. The mountain itself, when God descended upon the mountain, no one was permitted to touch the mountain. If you touched the mountain, you were subject to the death penalty. Why? Because when the divine presence was on the mountain, it's the most advanced level of holiness. But when the Shekhinah, when the divine presence ascended from the mountain, Mount Sinai became an ordinary piece of rock. So what determines whether something's holy or not holy? If God's associated with that location. If he's associated with the bush, the divine presence there, that earth is hallowed ground. He's associated with the mountain is holy. He takes the Jews for all eternity as his people. He says, our relationship is inextricable. The Jewish people become Goy Kadosh. We are a holy people, holy nation. At Sinai, and this is something, every blessing that we say prior to doing a mitzvah, we say, Asher Kidshonu b'mitzvosov. God sanctified us with his mitzvos. V'tzivanu, and he commanded us, whether it's to put on tzitzis, to put on tefillin, to ritualize our hands before we eat bread, to take the 4 species, to sit in the sukkah. The text is what? God has sanctified us with his mitzvos. Whatever. So what brings about sanctification? He gave the mitzvos to us to be sanctified. Since they are his commandments, through those commandments, we become holy. We become sanctified. The medium to bring about that sanctification is observing the commandments. That brings holiness. Why? Because again, if you use those mediums, now God has a relationship with you. That is the linkage to the source of all holiness, which is God himself. The law is that if you have a pair of tefillin and you keep them in the tefillin bag, the tefillin innately are holy. Why are they innately holy? Because you have the parchments in the boxes. Therefore, it's an object of holiness. The bag in which you put the tefillin, that bag is accommodating something which is innately holy. Because it's associated with something which is innately holy, Even the bag assumes a holy status due to association, due to accommodation. So a person who lives a life of doing the will of God, fully committed, not only is he part of a nation that's a holy people, he becomes holy because the more he does in the context of doing the will of God, that relation becomes more intimate. The more intimate that relation becomes between God and that individual, God's presence is associated with that person to a greater degree than with an ordinary Jew. So that person, his body, his entity, becomes a holy entity. Because what is the basis for holiness? God's relevance to that location, to that person, to whatever may be. So the more advanced the person is spiritually, doing the will of God, quantitatively and qualitatively, he advances in holiness because God has a greater degree of relevance to that person. That's the concept. Okay? The Torah tells us in this portion is called Kedoshim. God spoke to Moshe saying, Daber ala kol adas bnei Yisrael. Speak to the entire congregation of Israel. Not speak to the all. That means every man, woman, and child should be present when this communication is being given over. V'marta lehem, and you should say unto them, Kedoshim to you, you must be holy. You must be holy. Why must you be holy? Ki kodesh ani Hashem Elokechem. You must be holy because I am holy. I, your God, am holy. Therefore, you must be holy. What does one thing have to do with another? God is God. We're who we are. What exactly is the objective of the existence of the Jewish people? We're here. This is the testing grounds. This is what it's all about. We're challenged every moment of our lives. Do we do the will of God or don't we do the will of God? And if even we do we do it qualitatively speaking, or do we do it just haphazardly, by rote? Every moment and every nuance of involvement will determine the quality of your action. But that quality of action will generate and bring about holiness, because God says, when you do that, you're following my command, and therefore you are more my people. Our relationship becomes more intimate. Why do I want you to be holy and to act holy, which we'll explain in a moment? Because I am holy. If what it's all about is to have a relationship in this world and in the world to come, so you must engage in behavior which engenders this relationship. What type of behavior engenders this relationship? A behavior which generates a worthiness that God has an association with you. I'll give you an example. There's a law, we mentioned, the bag which you put tefillin in becomes holy because it's associated with tefillin, which are innately holy. What about the mantle on a Sefer Torah? The mantle on Sefer Torah. Because there's nothing holier than a Torah scroll, so the mantle which covers it assumes the same status of holiness as the scroll itself. So let's say it becomes worn, you have to bury it. As you bury a Torah scroll, if it becomes invalidated due to being damaged or whatever it may be, it has to be buried, you have to bury the cover. The cover of a Torah scroll, let's say the material you can't use any longer because it's become worn, but you're able to salvage some of the material, take the material and make it into a tefillin bag. Are you permitted? If that material served as the cover of a Sefer Torah, a Torah scroll, are you permitted to use it for the cover? And there's enough material, you can tailor a beautiful tefillin bag. You're not permitted. Why? So, because we have a principle, when it comes to holiness, we advance and we don't diminish it. Since the Torah scroll innately is holier than a pair of tefillin, using that material which accommodated the Sefer Torah, which assumed the same holy Sefer Torah, by putting it and using it as a tefillin bag, you're diminishing its status of holiness. We only advance. If you want to take the material that was for the tefillin bag and use it for a Torah scroll, it's not a problem. Because the innate holiness of a Torah scroll is greater than the holiness of tefillin. But to go in the other direction, where you're lessening the Kedusha, the holiness, it's inappropriate, and you're not permitted to do it. That's the law. Because whatever innately has greater spiritual value, God has greater relevance to that. And because God has greater relevance to that, therefore, it is holier. So God says, why do I want you to be holy? Because what it's all about is a relationship. And we have to create a commonality between us, because what is the basis for every relationship? Compatibility. And compatibility is based on commonality. So the greater the commonality, the greater the compatibility between the two parties. This is the concept. The way Ramban Nachmanides explains, what is the mitzvah of Kedoshim to you? You must be holy. And Rashi says, why must it be given over in a setting that all the Jews are present? Because the Torah its entirety is based upon this principle, on this mitzvah of being holy. So Ramban says, a person could live his life like an intellectual animal and not be in violation of any laws of the Torah. For instance, you could live like a hedonist, indulge in eating, in pleasure, everything within a permitted context. The food is kosher, the wine is kosher, the women maintain the laws of family purity, and the person is indulgent in the physical life like an animal. But the man says, did I do anything wrong? Whatever I did, I didn't violate the Torah. I kept dietary laws. I did this, I did that. The man has 25 women. There's no moment of the day that he doesn't have a woman, a wife, available for him to engage sexually with her. Does that have any relevance to holiness, to godliness? Now, God himself has no relevance to material, totally removed from physicality. But again, as human beings, we have needs. And the reason why God created those needs is because that's part of the challenge of life. We say, in kemach ein Torah. If there's no bread, there's no flour, there's no Torah. We're physical beings, we have to address our physical amenities. You can't live without eating, you can't live without sleeping, you can't live without drinking. And God wants you to procreate, to guarantee there's going to be another generation, to populate the world. So all that is a necessity. But to what degree do you engage in all that? To the degree that you have to. Anything more than that is called excess. So you live a life, what's Kedusha? I do what I'm supposed to do. Because when you eat, because you eat to live, and you don't live to eat, that's an act of what? That's an act of holiness. Because that's exactly what God wants you to do. To eat, to live. To procreate, to be able to have a family and raise them properly. But procreation is such a mundane physical action, all-consuming desire-wise. Doesn't make a difference. But I'm doing because God wants to bring that about, although it may be physical, but it's only due because that's the dictate of God. So that's not contradictory in what he is, because that's the function of a human being, a Jew, as he's meant to function. So as long as you function as he wants you to function, not as a hedonist, not as a glutton, not as a womanizer, none of that. All that, that's holiness. The whole concept of original sin, priest celibate, right? Because it's sin, it's unclean, it's lacking in holiness. The Talmud tells us that Chizkiyahu, the king of Judah, all of a sudden became deathly ill, and he's on his deathbed. And He was a very holy man. Chizkiyahu, the king of Judah. Isaiah the prophet comes to him and says to him, your state of being now, you will not come out of that bed, you will die. He says, what did I do wrong? He says, because you had an obligation to procreate, to have a child, and you didn't. He says, but how could I have had a child? I saw through my divine vision that the child I will have will be so evil, he'll be the most evil king in the history of the Jewish people. Therefore, I refrained from procreating. So Yeshaya the Navi says to him, Isaiah the prophet says to him, that's none of your business. That's not your concern. You have to raise a child according to your best ability. What he will be, that's up to God. That's nothing to do with you. Have an obligation. And if you have the child, you fulfilled it. What he will be, how he will be, that's not your concern. And that's an act of holiness. You must procreate. But what about if, when? There's no relevance. As long as you do the way God wants you to do it, that's holiness. You do it in the will of God. You create that commonality. Because you're living by God's credo, not by anybody else's credo. That's God's credo. Two people meet, lavdil, and immediately they bond phenomenally, like never before, because they find that between the two of them, the values, the perspectives, the quality of person, the refinement, it's almost identical. And the person says, I've never met a person who's so similar to myself in every sense of the word. So because of that commonality, they bond so easily. Lahavdil, you want to bond with God, which is the basis for all holiness? Assume a persona, a profile, which is similar to his. What is that? No relevance to material. Material, not for material. If the material is a means, that's holiness. If it's an end unto itself, that is no relevance to holiness. That's called indulgent. There's a famous story. One of the earlier, there's a sect of Hasidim. Today, it's one of the largest sects in the world. It's called Ger. In Europe, in Poland, there was a city called Gur, G-U-R. The way it's pronounced, the Jews pronounce Ger, like convert Ger, Ger Hasidim. So one of the earlier rebbes, the dynasty was established in the early 1800s, and he took a very beautiful, luscious apple, which was crisp, and the Rebbe, the head of the dynasty, takes it, and he looks at the apple, admires it, and he says, a bracha with tremendous kavanah, tremendous intent, and he articulates and verbalizes it, and then he takes a bite into the apple, and he eats it with enjoyment. What does the chassid do? The chassid wants to emulate the holy rabbi. So he takes the apple, says the bracha with this tremendous level of focus and intent. Also, he bites into that crisp apple. And he feels great. He's emulating the rabbi, the holy rabbi. The rabbi sees this, he calls him up, he says, I want to explain you something. I want to tell you the difference between me and you. When I took the apple, I didn't take the apple to eat the apple. I took the apple so I should be able to see a blessing to acknowledge what God gave me. When you took the apple, you wanted to eat the apple. Except being an observant Jew, you're not going to eat the apple unless you say a pre-blessing. That's the difference between us two. The Ger Rebbe, who was a holy man, he took that apple to fill its purpose, to acknowledge God that he provided that apple for human consumption. Not because I want to eat, therefore I'm not permitted to eat unless I say a blessing. It's a whole different approach. The way the Rebbe did it, that's to bring holiness. I'm addressing the objective of creation. I'm only eating it to acknowledge God that he's the creator of the fruit of the tree. So what's Kedoshim to you? You should not be this despicable, this unattractive person who lives by the Torah, but yet you're going through motions, you're mirroring it what it is, but you're only mimicking it. Because what you are, you're an indulgent person, you're the hedonist. So by doing it with that proper intent, that's called holiness. You should not be that. King Solomon says in Proverbs, Tzaddik ochel and soven nafsho. When a tzaddik eats, he only eats to the degree that he sates his soul, nothing more than that. What's the intent of the tzaddik? You can't live without eating. He only eats to the degree to sate his soul. More than that, he's not interested. Because more than that, automatically, is a compromise on your degree of spirituality. Because that means you're being drawn into the material. Drawing into the material means I have less relevance to God. As God has no relevance to the material, God says, for you to bond with me, we have to create a commonality which is as close as possible. Therefore, you wean yourself from material. The Ramchal asks an interesting question. What is the differentiating factor which is the most basic, fundamental between a human being and any other living creature, species? Free choice. A human being has choice, could override our instincts, our instinctive behavior. We could almost do anything, even though naturally you want to do something, you do something contrary to what your instinct is. There was a student, he visited Reb Eli Lapian in the early 60s, where he was up in the north near Haifa of Israel. And Reb Eli Lapian was a very holy man. He had the revelation of Eliyahu Novi at the age of 27 in Europe. Very holy man. So this Reb Eli Lapian, then he really was a man about 90 years old. He says to this young man who was about 20, he says, what is free choice? To do what you want to do or to do what you don't want to do? That's the question he asked this young man who was 20 years old, a yeshiva student. So he says, of course, free choice is to do what you want to do. He says, no. Free choice is to do what you don't want to do. We're inclined to do things which are contrary to what God wants, because we're physical. Free choice, God gives you the ability to do what naturally you don't want to do. Naturally you want to indulge. Naturally you want to be fully involved in pleasure. You want to be detached. What is free choice? Despite that, I go against the grain. And I do what I don't want to do because that's what God wants me to do. Don't want meaning what naturally you would do. It's going against the grain. But that's, something. But that's not natural. That's unnatural. But that's what man was endowed with. He could do something which is unnatural, but it's considered natural because that's the way God wants you to behave. And that's Kedusha. That's something out of the realm of natural. This is called supernatural. If you want to have to do with the supernatural being, which the being that's not bound by material, by limitation, you live within his prescription of life, which is doing something which is contrary to the inclination of the human being. We're inclined to be physical because we're physical beings. We have all the drives that an animal has. Sexual drive, possession-wise, amassing, control, power. That's the human drive. We have to go against that, not to feed into that and be drawn into that and continuously inflate our ego and have our ego stroked, because the more you stroke it, the more you become inflated. The more you become hungry for power. When you negate it, that creates humility. And through the conditioning, you become more humble, naturally humble, because you begin recognizing what you should be, and you're not there yet. Therefore, you have no basis to be arrogant, recognizing your failings and your shortcomings. So, Kedoshim to you. Why do I want you to be holy? Because I am holy. Because what it's all about is to have this relationship. Because the world to come is having a relationship with God. So Ramchal explains, why did God give us free choice? Because God wants to establish a commonality which is as close as could be for a human being to God. When God does anything, God is not compelled to do anything. He does because he chooses to do what he wants. Therefore, he endowed the human being with an ability to do whatever he wants. So now, as a result of doing the right thing, why did you do the right thing? Not that you were compelled to do the right thing, because you chose to do the right thing. So as a result of that, the profile of the human being within the context of free choice, why do you do the wrong thing? Because you chose to do the wrong thing. Nothing compelled you to do the wrong thing. And why do you do the right thing? Because I independently chose to do the right thing. So that persona is the persona of God. God does whatever he wants. He endowed the human being, and that's the image of God. Just as God does what he wants, the human being is endowed with that. And doing that, that is the ultimate in commonality, which allows the compatibility to be able to cleave to him if you live within this context of life. There's a famous word from Rav Noach Weinberg, blessed memory, who was the founder of the Eshet Torah Yeshiva in Israel, which was famous Balchuva Yeshiva. He says, how do you discern between a dead fish and a live fish? He says, a live fish swims upstream. A dead fish flows downstream. A live fish goes against the current. A dead fish goes with the current. We have the ability to go against the current, and that's what free choice is. Naturally, we're inclined to go in one direction. Free choice gives us the ability to go against the current, against the grain. But you're not going against the grain to be a nonconformist. That's not the reason. You're going against the grain because God says that's the objective of life. Not to give in to your animalistic inclinations, but go against them. The Ramchal asks, why did God create a person to naturally do only the right thing? Why do you have to create a person to give him a choice to do the right thing or the wrong thing? Naturally do the right thing. See, he explains that if a person's in the position where he has no control over his behavior, and he naturally does either evil or good, either one, doesn't make a difference, the action is not attributed to him. It's due to an external force which is making him behave a certain way, but it has nothing to do with the person. It's like a robot. You create a robot and it behaves a certain way. The robot the action is unrelated to the behavior of the robot, because the robot only behaves that way is because whoever programmed the robot programmed it to behave in a certain way. So if the human being would naturally do good because God programs him, because there's no evil inclination, and naturally you do good, the action is not attributed to you, because there's an external force called God that created in a way we have no choice but to do the right thing. So you say, so what's so terrible? The answer is because God wants to create a compatibility that you should maximize on the relationship with God. So the greater the commonality, the greater the compatibility. So as God, as we said, does as he wants, and he's not compelled in any way, God says the human being is a being that will not be compelled. He can do anything he wants. As a result of that, when he does the right thing, he does the will of God, that action is attributed to himself. Once it's attributed to himself, that state is due to himself. It's not due to an external power. Therefore, the commonality is the same. Therefore, the human being is able to cleave course, they're fully compatible for that reason. That's Ramchal. Let's get back to the first question. The first question was asked. So let's say a person was born in a jungle, or he's born in a vacuum where he doesn't know anything. So naturally, he's only going to gravitate to what he's inclined to do. So if that's the case, naturally he's going to do the wrong thing. So how is that person ever held accountable for anything? Basically, he has no choice. That's the question. So firstly, there's certain natural inclinations that if you play into them, they become intensified. And if you don't, then you're able to control them. So this person, many years ago, he came from the Soviet Union before Glasnost, where things were there was a tight lid, that religion was not accepted. So the person asked me, and this person was a Russian, he became a Baal Tshuva. So he says to me, and he became a Baal Tshuva in the United States. He says, back in Russia, where people were atheists, it's an atheistic society, how could they be held accountable for being atheists? They never had a chance because religion was outlawed. So that they didn't believe in God, you can't fault them for not believing in God. That's the question he asked me. So I shared with him something Rebbe Chanan Wasserman Zech Tzaddik L'Varcha says. And I told over the story in the past. You'll recognize the story. This person had masters, which they never saw the light of day. Rembrandt, Van Gogh, all of them. And he invites a curator of the most leading museum in the world to see his collection, his private collection of masters, which even he never saw these. And he hosts him. He's a very wealthy man, hosts this curator. And after he says, now we're ready to walk down the gallery and to show these masters. And under each painting, there's a plaque with the master who painted that painting. And he walks down and he sees these paintings. It's breathtaking. Whatever he saw, he never saw anything compared to this. And okay, and he says, you'd be the luckiest man in the world to own these kind of masters. Nobody's ever seen these. I had the privilege, you showed them to me. So he says, you know something? Why don't you come to my office? We'll have a private chat. Comes to the office. He says, I want to give you some background on these paintings. These paintings were not painted by Rembrandt, not by Van Gogh, not by this or that. I'll tell you how it happened. I had a canvas on my table, on my desk. I had the window open. I had vials of paint on the desk. And there was a storm that was brewing. And I went to sleep, and I forgot to close the window. I came back in the morning. The vials were knocked over. The paint was splattered all over. And I pick up the canvas, and this is the master. It's not Rembrandt. It happened by itself. And it's not Van Gogh. It happened by itself. The same story. It repeated itself. So the person says, you're talking to an expert. I appreciate every stroke is a stroke of genius. The color scheme, everything. You tell me this happened. This is random. This happened by itself. Impossible. If you look at creation and you see divine genius in every aspect of creation, and you see the symmetry of creation and the function of creation, it's impossible to deny that there's no creator. Impossible. That this happened by itself. It evolved. There definitely was somebody behind it directing this evolvement to develop as it did, even if you don't believe in the actual creation ex nihilo immediately. But this couldn't happen by itself. Anybody who's a scientist, although the scientist doesn't want to allow God into the analysis and the evaluation, but they understand things which we don't appreciate because they understand the ingeniousness beyond that is in every even in a hair follicle, or in anything. The reproductive system, the neurological system, anything. So if that's the case, why doesn't it resonate with us? We see it. Why doesn't it? It's obvious. It's God's fingerprint is on every aspect of this creation. And we say it every morning in Shachris. How immense is your creation? It was done with tremendous wisdom. You can't deny the divine wisdom that went into every aspect of creation, but we don't see it. We're not touched by it. We're not moved by it. Evidently, because there are all kinds of distractions, there's blockages, and therefore it doesn't resonate with us. But if you remove all the filters and you see it as it is, it's impossible not to be touched. So when I said to this Russian, I said, in Russia, because of the communistic system, you can't survive on whatever they pay you in the factory. So every Russian, and it's known, they justify, you work in a foundry, you steal some metal. You work in a clothing factory, you steal some bolts of cloth, and you sell it on the black market. Wherever you are, for the sake of survival, everybody's stealing. But you realize when you steal, when things are difficult, unless it's a question of life-threatening, you're not permitted to steal. So we do many things which actually dulls our senses, our spiritual senses, not to be able to appreciate, to allow these observations to resonate within us. But if a person would live by the book and not do anything which is transgressional, your spiritual nerve endings will be very acute. You'll pick up everything. Avraham Avinu was born into a pagan world. Pagan. He looked at the world, he said, I see a citadel on fire. It's illuminated. Who's the master of the citadel? We ever look at this world and say, who's the master of this world? Who are you that impressed? They'd say, I was living in Hawaii. This is before the volcanoes, the earthquakes, and everything else that went on over there. Right? The lushness of nature, the beauty, the ocean, the mountains, the vegetation. It's something which is like beyond in terms of the beauty. That beauty you don't see anywhere. You're touched by that beauty. Who could create such beauty? And you move by that beauty. But everybody, when you touch and moved, everybody expresses it differently. But if you have a certain perspective, you express it in another way. It's unbelievable what kind of world God created for us. I always say, you have Columbia Presbyterian, you have Cornell. You have building after building, 14, 16-story buildings filled with medical equipment, dialysis machines, lung heart machines, all kinds of things to maintain a person that he should be able to live. God creates a human being, 2 little kidneys with lungs and a heart, and it's healthy, functions. Here we have billions and billions and billions of dollars worth of equipment, and endless manpower has to go into it, training to be able to do it, to maintain a human being. If the kidney fails, if the lung fails, if the heart fails. God says that no, a new child is born, healthy, intact, naturally functions. It's amazing. If it starts malfunctioning, look what you need. You need a whole system, endless doctors, endless employees to maintain it. It's not to be amazed. We have the bracha sheyotzar after you do your bodily functions. Yeah, there's a blessing you say to acknowledge, to thank God that He created us in a way that we have oracles, we have openings in our system, we're able to relieve ourselves. Otherwise, we would die. Just focus on that. Person has a blockage, God forbid. Person would die. Everything in life is focus. If you're focused long enough and you reflect when you're focused and you allow yourself to be touched, you will be touched. But unfortunately, we're not that focused. Even when we're focused, we don't reflect long enough. We're onto something else. As a human being, to be impacted, affected, you need reflection. Focus is not enough. In addition to focus, next is reflection. And the more you reflect as a human being, the more you begin appreciating and absorbing what you're reflecting on. And that's the reality.